Hello and welcome. America is considered a bigger threat to world peace than any other country, say many of the international polls. And that's one of the main image problems the US is having to address since the so-called war on terror. Well, the massive unpopularity of the Iraq war has hurt opinions of America, not only in predominantly Muslim countries, but in Europe and Asia as well. The administration has tried different ways to improve its standing, including radio and TV stations in many different languages and cultural exchange programs. But the question today remains, how effective is public diplomacy at addressing the root problems of America's negative image? You can take part in the show with your questions. Now, you can also visit livestation.com for an easy download of the video player, tune into Al Jazeera English and click on the chat room where you can send your comments and questions in real time. Joining me is the top US official in charge of waging the war of ideas, James Glassman. Mr. Glassman is the US State Department's undersecretary for public diplomacy and public affairs and has spent decades working in the American media, writing business columns for the Washington Post, anchoring a show on CNN, and leading some of America's most influential magazines. I welcome you to the show.
Thank you, Rose.
Right. Now, if I'm not much mistaken, your job is essentially to win hearts and minds, to target the international community and create a better impression of America. What do you feel is the biggest challenge you're facing?
Well, let me just say at the outset that we're not really in the PR business, that we're not out to, in the short term, change the way people think about America. That's really a long-term process, and we do it through exchange programs, we do it through talking about America's story, but we look at it as a very long-term process. So when we bring people here on a Fulbright fellowship, for example, we don't expect to get much in the way of a payback on that as far as America's image is concerned, sometimes for 10 or 20 years. And one of the big problems we face today is that a lot of those programs were cut back during the 1990s after the end of the Cold War, and it's taken a while to build them back. But certainly we want people to trust and respect the United States, but more than that, we want to help in public diplomacy, in my part of the State Department, to achieve America's interests, which are specifically to reduce threats to this country and the world, and to promote freedom.
Now, I'll get on to how that might happen, but obviously changing the image of America presumably is a big part of that. What about changing the image Americans have of themselves and how they regard the world position? And I'll illustrate that with an email we got from New York, if I may, sir. Wayne, here in the USA, wrote in saying, "Our image doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is what the American people want, not the world." Now, can Americans change this sort of attitude to the outside world?
Well, it's true that I think throughout American history there has been a strain of isolationism or inward looking, partly because we've got a big country, there's a lot to do here, and for many people the idea is, well, we don't need to worry about the outside world. But I think that's changed, and it's changed a great deal in the last few decades. And certainly we do look to the outside world for trade, and we do look to the rest of the world for approval, and I think that's important. I think most Americans would have a different point of view, but let me just say this: that certainly America, like any other country, like India or Jordan, has its own interests to pursue. We don't conduct a big poll of the world to decide what our interests are.
We tried to get a number of emails. We had a lot of emails coming in for you, and we tried to get a sample without them being too many the same, but there were a couple expressing similar sentiments. And funny you mentioned India. The first one is from India, from Shaista Salam, who says, "The image of the US is one of a brutal occupier, human rights violator, and ruthless terrorist. I don't think this violent nation has any hope to change for the better. It's worse since its politicians are all slaves to Israel, and none of them care for the ordinary Americans' well-being." And the second one from the US, from Michael Anderson in Oregon, says, "Our image abroad, backed up by our actions, seems to be that of a selfish, cruel, fading but still brutal empire hell-bent on taking resources from countries who have them and installing compliant puppet regimes to advance our interests at the point of a gun." And I wonder how hard is your...
It sounds like I'm back in the 50s listening to Soviet propaganda. Look, certainly some people hold those opinions. There's no doubt about that. It's interesting you should mention India, which is one of the countries that has a very high opinion of the United States, as does Japan, as does South Korea, as does the Philippines, as do many countries in the world. But certainly some people do see us as a brutal occupier. We're not, or a slave to Israel or something like that. We're not. This is the administration that first proposed the two-state solution. I think those are unfair characterizations.
And I have to say, I mean, from my travels and I talk to people, I think there's a general feeling that Americans are loved as people. But I think the difficulty people have is differentiating the administration and the policies that they witness from the American people, who I think at grassroots level they do tend to like very much. How difficult does it make your job then?
Well, you know, the way we look at it, and our research shows, there are really three issues involved in respect and trust toward America, sort of America's image. One is the policies. There certainly are people who don't like our policies, and we know that. But I can say that in the war of ideas, which is really achieving America's interests in promoting freedom, reducing threats, we get along with many people and many countries that disagree with us on, let's say, Iraq or Israel and Palestine. So policies are important, there's no doubt about that. Second thing is, and I think this is very important, is a lot of people around the world say that America does not respect their point of view. That even if we are going to pursue our own interests, as we are, as India will, we need to show more respect toward other people around the world. And I agree with that. I think that criticism is a legitimate and the one that we're trying to address. And finally, I think there are a lot of policies of the United States and principles that the rest of the world does not understand very well. And we haven't done as good a job as we can in getting them across. And the one most important one that I want to say here is there are vast majorities in Muslim societies who believe the United States is out to destroy Islam and replace it with Christianity. I mean, there are very, very few Americans would say, oh yeah, that's what we're out to do. But people believe that, and we need to right that particular inaccuracy.
Now, I'll make it back to that in a second, but one thing that's interesting is the financial crisis that's now taken hold across the world. A lot of it, of course, people are linking a lot of it to what's happening in the US. Some are saying, though, that the way different countries are recovering shows a decoupling of what's happening in terms of globalization, that America perhaps has a different position in the world now. And an email we got from California raises some interesting thoughts here. Bob Laribo wrote in saying, the world is moving to a different regime where the major countries and regions will set their own course and will no longer just follow Washington's or Wall Street's lead. This is better for them, and in the long run will be better for America itself. So I wonder, is America somewhat losing its relevance in the world in this respect?
Well, I don't think so. And let me just say that I don't think countries are following Wall Street's lead anyway. We live in a very globalized society, whether people like it or not. I like it. I think it's beneficial for the prosperity of the world. And one of the things we need to really worry about is if in this crisis that we don't go back to what countries did during the 1930s, which in fact was to say, well, we're going to save our own skin. We're going to adopt a so-called beggar thy neighbor policy, which countries did in the 30s. And one of the ways they did that was seal themselves off from the outside world, cut back on trade, and so forth. Our very strong policy today is to do the opposite, to be very aware that there are developing nations, especially, that are going to be suffering as a result of what is happening globally. And for example, the Doha round. It seems to me that this could be an opportunity to reinvigorate the Doha round, which is really to the benefit of developing countries. So we're looking in that direction right now.
Georgia here in the USA is on the line, and Ayafu, you have a question, please?
Yes, sir. My question is concern of the poor nations. Why United States is running behind the poor nations like Somalia and Eritrea, and they don't find any terror they are against United States?
Okay, so are you saying why are they not supporting those countries, or why are they?
No, support is another issue. They destroy, they kill them, they abuse the society, and they send them military with a lot of money. Instead, they feed them, they kill, like Somalia, for example.
Okay, so it's basically U.S. policies in places like Somalia and Africa where IAFU feels there isn't a just policy towards supporting the countries in the right direction.
I must say I certainly disagree. In the case of Somalia, quite the opposite. Somalia is an example where I think American intervention has been quite beneficial as far as trying to restore some kind of stability to that country.
There are a lot of people from overseas that I meet who seem to say they believe that the U.S. foreign policy is largely responsible for America's insecurity. That is to say that its security issues stem from the fact it's approached terrorism and the so-called war on terror in the wrong way, in that it's by creating the sense of isolationism that America is right and is a bully, as some of our viewers have indicated, that it's actually helping to nurture or fuel the negative attitude, which then generates it. So it's like a self-perpetuating, that if America looked at the root problems of terrorism, it could actually have far greater results rather than trying to just have this sort of overview of going in there and destroying everything.
Well, I'm not sure what you or others think are the root causes of terrorism. I mean, if you say the root causes of terrorism are, for example, poverty, I don't think there's any country in the world that has done more to try to relieve poverty in the developing world than the United States, or disease. I mean, what we have done in Africa has been quite remarkable. And in fact, our image in Africa is off the charts. It's so high.
A lot would argue that it's not poverty that's the root cause for example, creating people who have a terroristic approach to the U.S.
Right. I frankly think that it is a twisted and brutal ideology that exploits young people. I think many young people who feel that they have a lack of opportunity or maybe bewildered by the changes that they see around them are sucked into this violent extremist ideology, and I think they're the ones who are at risk, and they're the ones that we, in our approach to the war of ideas or ideological engagement, are trying to do something about. And it's not, by the way, only in countries that have Muslim majorities. It's also in a country like Colombia, which I just came back from a couple of weeks ago, where we have seen thousands of young people caught up with the FARC and a terrible life and doing quite brutal things, and are now leaving the FARC. And I think we're going to be seeing the same kinds of things in the Middle East and in South Asia.
Mr. Glassman, don't go away. We have more questions. We have to take a short break now, but more of our discussion with America's top public diplomacy official when we return.
Dum